On a show as fantasy as Game of Thrones, with dragons, white zombies and enchanted lands, one would not expect an exceptional historical accuracy. And yet, as history buffs, we were both quite pleased to notice the care with which it has been done, in many ways much more than a lot of historical fictions. On this video, we will put into light the details that struck us as very realistic and well researched.
Winterfell of any of them is probably the closest to a kind of traditional Northern European world with kind of thick, strong castle walls.
Out of all the settings of the show, Winterfell is indeed the most accurate and the closest to a European medieval castle, being based on castle ward and everything, and it'll be also the setting of most of our analysis. You can see that the top of the towers resemble castles that we've already treated. First of all, the exterior look is very accurate with these round towers with a sort of round crown around them. Yes, you would expect a pointy hat as on most of the castles in your imagination, but as we mentioned in our Carcassonne video, you have the hoardings on top of the towers. And the hoardings, if they're covered with a round circular rooftop, that's exactly what it would look like. And you can see that on the reconstitution of the Coucy castle. Furthermore, if we penetrate the inner court of the castle, we can notice that it's not fancy at all. It's muddy, there are animals everywhere, there are sheds with the smith, the stallboy, the butcher, etc., etc. In fact, it really shows that the crew has made extensive research on what the inside court of a medieval castle would look like. And the fact that we only ever see the same setting, the same court, which isn't that big, makes us think of an average medieval castle of the countryside. In fact, if you were wondering about approximately how many people really lived in those castles in the Middle Ages, you would be surprised by the answer: it wasn't that many people. Depending on the size of the estate, first the importance of the lord, around the 12th-13th century, which seems to be the mimicked period, there would be about an average of 20 people in a classic castle. 1. The lord's family. 2. A handful of guards and their wives who'd be the kitchen wench and the domestics. Then you would have a chaplain or a clergyman. Add to that the smith, a couple squires, the butcher, the estate administrator, and that's it. But Winterfell is not an average castle because it is the castle of the Warden of the North, which would be the equivalent of a duke. He's a very rich, important lord, and as such, his castle exceeds the regular size, which you can only see from the outside shots. For example, this famous court we only ever see. Behind it you can see the red tree of the sacred wood, which is in fact right there, and the court is this tiny spot over there. And on some specific occasions, like the coming of the king and all his court, you can appreciate the sheer size of the castle, with all the people inside welcoming the king and all of the people from the outside being able to enter. Just like during the famous Battle of Season 8, with thousands of people defending the castle and thousands of zombies at the same time. But in any case, both visions are realistic. The small average medieval castle with about 20 people in it, as well as the huge castle of the Warden of the North. Castle life in all of its details is also quite well rendered. Boys versus girls' occupations.
As always, well done.
Thank you. And your dress, did you make it? Such a talent. You must make something for me.
With some exceptions, of course.
Very dead. Come.
But the use of the Great Hall is what pleased us the most. See, in any castle that would be inhabited by a lord and his family, there would automatically be such a large, fancy room to achieve a certain kind of goals. And for each of these goals, it had to be ostentatious and large. 1. Receiving your own people once a week to hear their complaints and establish justice.
Of course I remember.
We can spare 4 masons for a week, my lord. Will that be sufficient to repair your walls?
I believe it will.
We didn't want him here all day, did we? But listening to people you'd rather not listen to is one of your responsibilities as Lord of Winterfell.
I just make a pause here to stress that very important detail. Yes, lords had lots of privileges, but they also had responsibilities. We have a tendency to see everything one-sided. It wasn't that simple.
The war is not over. And I promise you, friend, the true enemy won't wait out the storm. He brings the storm.
2. The military and political meetings.
The king in the north!
And 3. Throwing fancy feasts with important lords. In the Middle Ages, the nobles would have banners, which means that they possessed a land more or less extended, which is called the ban. Within the ban, there would be some people or serfs who would pay taxes to the lord in exchange for protection, and the providing of some practical installations which would also be taxed, such as the oven, the mill, or the wine press. In the pyramidal society of the Middle Ages, each important lord would have bannermen, which means they would have the exact same privileges, but on a smaller scale. And so, until the knights who would be at the bottom of the social pyramid.
Call the banners.
Sir Jeremy, my father's bannerman.
The scouts were wrong. There were 2,000 Stark bannermen, not 20.
In this ancient vassalic system, each lesser lord would swear homage to a more important one. In exchange for military service, they were granted protection as well as land.
If we can't protect our own bannermen, why should they protect us? Go, Sir Roderick. Take the men you need.
Lord Glover,
There's nothing else to say.
I would remind you that House Glover is pledged to House Stark, sworn to answer when called upon.
If they did not honor this promise, they could face banishment and become bandits. It all comes back to the word ban. At the top of the pyramid is, of course, the king, who, according to this system, is the one providing directly or indirectly land and castle to everybody. As a result, he's at home everywhere.
"9 years. Why haven't I seen you? Where the hell have you been?"
Guarding the north for you, Your Grace. Winterfell is yours.
As we've just said, in the early Middle Ages, the ultimate social status is nobility. Nobility means military. Fighting earns you land and taxpayers and privileges that keep you from the necessity of working. In a troubled period when everybody is fighting for land and authority and nobody's permanently safe, it is understandable. In fact, even though vulgar, it is quite accurate the way Bronn explains it. Let's hear it from him.
Highgarden will never belong to a cutthroat.
No? Who were your ancestors? The ones who made your family rich? Fancy lads in silk? They were fucking cutthroats. That's how all the great houses started, isn't it? With a hard bastard who was good at killing people. Kill a few hundred people, they make you a lord. Kill a few thousand, they make you king. And then...
You are Lord Gendry Baratheon of Storm's End, the lawful son of Robert Baratheon, because that is what I have made you.
So yeah, that's exactly how it could have happened in the early Middle Ages.
A fitting reward for a hero.
Therefore, in the early Middle Ages, violence and fighting was the essence of the noble's life. So much so that even their hobbies reflected that reality. The number one noble sport was, of course, jousting or tournament. On top of being a good training, it was also a display of virility, pretty to watch, and symbolic.
Thank you, Sir Loris.
It was so popular, it even caused the death of the French king Henri II de Valois, a death supposedly prophesied by Nostradamus. Hunting, of course, was the absolute privilege of the nobles. Boy, did they love their pound of flesh and blood.
You win! Run, Daddy! Run!
Sometimes it would lead to tragic deaths. Well, what can you do?
Robert, we were hunting a bull.
King Robert Baratheon, murdered by a pig.
In fact, the French king Philippe le Bel also died from a hunting accident. And after all these very brutal entertainments, of course they would need to party. They liked to party because, well, they liked to party, right? But it was also a way to show your wealth to your guests, whoever they were, and it could always prove a good political move.
First time in the north, Your Grace?
Yes. Lovely country.
I'm sure it's very grim.
Without getting into the complex description of all the religions throughout the show, we will just focus on one aspect of the castle, which was the oratory or the private chapel. All the lords would need a place for cult, and they had a private chaplain who would do the office as well as teaching the kids.
Good. Words, ours is the fury, lords the Baratheons. The Westerland. Sigil, a lion. Words, a Lannister always pays his debts.
No. A common saying, but not their official motto.
In Winterfell, the place of cult is the Sacred Wood, and the castle was conveniently built just beside it.
All these years, and I still feel like an outsider when I come here.
You have 5 northern children. You're not an outsider.
I wonder if the old gods agree.
And it is the place for Sansa's wedding. Our last point will be details of the warfare. Well, even though they could not resist the temptation of situating the battles at night with flaming arrows, even though it makes no sense whatsoever, we can understand it's much more cinematographic, and so many other movies have fallen into this trap. So we'll forgive because, again, Game of Thrones is a fantasy show, so there's no problem. But when it comes to details like what do you think the gods will throw on the head of the attackers from the wall walk? Yes, stones. Stones were piled up the castle walls when an attack was expected. They were not stupid. Stones are free, recyclable, and they can do a lot of damage from a certain height with a certain weight. I mean, it's quite gruesome, but it's true. Plus, it's so much easier and cheaper to maneuver than, say, pitch to torch your enemies. Granted, it's more spectacular with the fire and everything, like you can see in most of the other movies, but it's not at all realistic. I mean, look at that! Are they using a hose? I mean, think about the logistics alone. The wall walks are narrow enough, filled with guards and archers. Now add to that the big fat cauldrons with the big fat fire underneath. Well, here in this movie, it takes it even further. I mean, look at that. Explosion, bam, wow, fire, spectacular. This is just ridiculous. Chaud devant, chaud! what is this goo anyway? Oil? Pitch? Fuel? Too expensive, too anachronistic. In conclusion, this video of course doesn't cover it all. It is just a number of points that we particularly enjoyed. But for example, we didn't even touch the costume area because it's really not our expertise. But we wanted to applaud the demonstration that you can be both entertaining and fantastic while doing a little bit of research and not thinking your audience is stupid. As Game of Thrones is coming to an end, this is the end of an era and we wanted to say goodbye in our own way. So thank you for following us.